Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar, The Changing Paradigm, What Happens When You Put Identity at the Center of Security. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. I have a few logistical items before I turn it over to our speaker this morning. First, if you have questions for the panel, please submit them through the Q&A for the speaker. Please submit them through the Q&A chat window. We are recording this session, and we'll be sharing the link with those that are unable to make it today, or if you want to share with colleagues after the fact. I did just launch the poll, so the polling questions are available to you. I'd appreciate your responses. And lastly, the slides will also be posted after the webinar, and look for a follow-up email with the link and to the recording and to the slides themselves. So now let's get started with the webinar. Our presenter today is Joe Gottlieb, who is a member of our Executive Advisory Board and provides board oversight of our technical content and technical working groups. As Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at SailPoint, Joe directs corporate strategy, acquisitions, and technology alliances based on the company's growth objectives. He has spent his entire career working with enterprise customers, primarily in the security, database, and networking domains, with previous executive roles at McAfee, SunSage, and Nokia. And now I'll turn it over to Joe to get the show started.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. This title hopefully has grasped your attention. A changing paradigm, what happens when you put identity at the center of security. It really is reflective of some major changes that we see happening in the industry as enterprises look to address the advancing threat landscape with their portfolios and strategies for engaging in cybersecurity. And in particular, it's reflective of the main mission of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, which I'll review today in the context of this question. But before we get right into that, let's take a look at how we're doing as an industry, right? It seems that we've got some, hold on one second, there we go. Recent research has indicated that while there were fewer breaches in 2018, the actual number of identity records that were stolen actually went up, and for the total really reaching 446 million. So this is just a data point to think about as we continue to protect our enterprises from these data breaches. Notably, also, we've identified that the losses that are accumulating are growing as well, and the Hirschevek Group forecasts that $6 trillion will be lost annually worldwide by 2021. That's a doubling in 6 years when you think about it, because we recognize around $3 trillion in lost value in 2015. So if you start to extrapolate that, things are moving in a direction that's pretty serious. And if we then compare that to the total spend in security, products and services that Gartner estimates at $114 billion in 2018, you can get to this catchphrase, this sort of conclusion that we spent $114 billion in security to lose somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion. And I know that's provocative and a bit playful, but the point should help us to understand that the current approach is challenged, to be sure. And that's a way we can look at the enterprise challenges of today. The cybersecurity challenge is relentlessly and cumulatively challenging. What do we mean by that? The fact that the landscape continues to advance, the attackers improve their methods, yet we also still have to protect against the basic stuff, because the attackers, they exist in a range of capabilities. There are still low-level things happening that use very basic tools. So if you think of something as simple as antivirus, still important to keep in place to make sure we're not allowing very, very basic things to happen, while we have to continue to advance in our other endpoint security mechanisms to thwart or reduce the risk of some of these more advanced attacks. And as you think about it and zoom out, we can clearly see that single vendor approaches are not working. This is not new. This has been true to security for years and years. Security is one of those domains because of that advancing threat landscape and the sophistication of the attacks and the asymmetric defense environment that we find ourselves in, meaning that we are only as powerful or defended as our weakest link. They only need to find one area of entrance to compromise to be able to really have some impact on us. the security industry has had to deal with new technologies that address new attack methods while consolidating wherever possible existing technologies that can come together in a suite or a package that is more easily managed or more easily integrated. And then meanwhile, notably, compromised identities are still the leading cause of breaches. And frankly speaking, protecting identities and doing security in a more identity-precise manner has not been the state of the art. And that is really the primary reason why we formed the Identity-Defined Security Alliance, to bring together identity and security technologies to make them more interoperable, make them more effective for the enterprise that is needing them to be more easily adopted to achieve their goals in cybersecurity. So that's the new approach that we're articulating here with this effort, the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. First off, identity is very critical. You hear talk about the identity being the new perimeter. Well, that is a reference to the fact that we are in a situation where we can't trust our network anymore. We can't trust our systems and applications completely. We have to be more deterministic, more methodical, more intentional about how we're doing very identity precise access. We need to pull our cybersecurity technologies together to work well together to achieve these meaningful effectiveness goals, right? We've got a lot of technology. It's always been true. So that effort continues, making sure that these things are working well together. And we know that every business transaction, attack surface, or target involves a credential or a piece of data. And as this is evolving into containers and new forms of distributed computing on top of infrastructure as a service platforms like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform, we are seeing a change with DevOps and a pace of change that forces us to direct these technologies to new domains, new frontiers, because the business transactions are now happening in these new domains. And frankly, those domains are less protected. The potential to protect them is greater, but our understanding of how we're applying our policies to them is on the edge. And then last but not least, given how much we've invested in security, it's really important that we don't look for silver bullets. We don't look to throw stuff out. We look to leverage the portfolio that we have to make it incrementally more effective as we bring on new technologies that ideally should be selected based upon their ability to integrate with the whole. And so we believe that there are some great benefits that can be teased out by an approach to security that is more identity defined. First off, we can leverage increasingly open software platforms and tech stacks and API-first cloud services. That's a great opportunity. It is a lot easier to integrate security technologies and identity and security technologies than it ever has been in the past. And so this is something for us to leverage to drive the benefits of pace and ease. And frankly, with finite capacity in all of our roadmaps, it's much easier to tackle things for interoperability because the integration efforts are made more easy by these platforms. It allows us to not rely upon single point defense mechanisms, and in fact involved a broader set of identity and security components because they can talk to each other more effectively, because we can establish more specific controls between them. And that's this balanced, fresh set of detective and preventive controls that we believe this approach to security can deliver. Last but not least, this allows organizations to tackle security with a more precise identity-aware and identity-specific approach, right? Instead of groping about with more probabilistic methods and algorithms that are having a high degree of false positive, we can get more involved with the very, very intentional and explicit and specific identity-specific access scenarios, how they need to be authenticated, how they need to be authorized, how they need to be monitored and responded to in the context of that specificity, i.e. very specific knowledge of users, very specific knowledge of what they have to do what they have to access to do their job, and the conditions that we can expect during those sessions. You'll see a picture there at the right, and I'll blow up that picture a bit later to give a bit more color on the different elements. But what you can see we're doing is we're connecting users to data across clients, networks, and services that are then protected by a combination of identity and security technologies who interoperate through shared context, an understanding of risk, shared and coordinated policies, as well as workflows. So let's talk a bit about the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. This is our mission. We are a nonprofit organization. We are facilitating community collaboration and developing a framework and practical guidance that help enterprise organizations put identity at the center of their security strategy. So we want to make this identity-defined security effort more easy to adopt and therefore translating to more attractive business outcomes, both in terms of improving security, reducing risk, and making compliance more straightforward. You can see the membership companies that are involved. It really is a combination of security and identity vendors as well as security and identity solution integrators. We thought it would be very important to take both the vendor perspective as well as the integrator perspective, these integrators being involved with delivering solutions that span these technologies to enterprise organizations, to mix together those perspectives to make sure that we're developing these materials and this body of work that would best suit the enterprise organizations. We have a customer advisory board that represents the perspective of several enterprise organizations. And our goal is to develop a large community of enterprise practitioners that can use these tools, techniques, methods, and insight to have more success with their cybersecurity postures. So we deliver on our mission through a variety of things. So there's a lot of collaboration that happens across these vendor groups. We talk about how we can make our technologies more interoperable, how we can do that in increasingly standard but still very impactful ways. We develop thought leadership through blogs, webinars, speaking engagements like this, where we share what we've learned in talking together and what we've learned talking to end customers. We are building and evolving what we would refer to as an identity-centric security framework. And this is a combination of really vendor-agnostic best practices, security controls, and use cases. Our goal here is to take a step away from our very singular vendor roles and really think about how this is coming together for the enterprise across this necessarily heterogeneous portfolio of technology. And so we really have to take our sort of vendor hats off, think about vendor-agnostic best practices, controls, and use cases so that we can make this that much more useful for the end enterprise. The material comes together in one of our most important deliverable types, and that is customer implementation stories. So as enterprises are starting to have success adopting these approaches within their environments, we want to be able to document that and share that around so other people can see validation of the methods and get ideas for how they can be successful on their specific journeys. And of course, we're building this community whereby this material can spawn discussion and challenge and evolution as we share experiences and we validate these methods that we're developing. So that's a little bit about the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Now I want to dive into some of our work product and talk about what really happens when you put identity at the center of security. So one of the things that we did was we took a real fresh look at what was the state of security and what were the technology elements where security was showing up and defending and protecting, right? And not all security is bound within one of these elements, be it a device, a network, a compute facility, whether it's a service or an infrastructure as a service offering or a server itself in a private data center. Of course, there's applications and there's storage. And so you have a variety of technologies that are either sitting atop these things or operating within. You have these things themselves adopting more and more secure architectures and employing security methods themselves. And then you also have services, security services that are spanning these elements. But what we observed was that critically and notably, a lot of these infrastructure elements aren't embodying all of the authentication, authorization, and identity and governance administration technologies or approaches that we tend to see in the identity and access management world, right? And so making sure that these technologies can work well with these embedded security services became really the foundation of our mission. And so one of the things we looked at, and I know this is a little bit complicated, but as we blew this out, we realized that there were three basic types of process or interactions that were occurring. We always see an originating entity, be it a human or a process, that begins the interaction or triggers the interaction. And it always tends to be, we had some philosophical debates about this, but it always tends to be an interaction that ultimately is either creating, reading, updating, or deleting a piece of data. Even if that piece of data is the actual state of an application and that you would think of it the way that you administer applications, that's still a data state change that is involved. And so whether it's a human operating on a device, connecting over a network to some service where there's an interaction with data, you might have a device, a process on a device reaching all the way out to a piece of data, or you may have a server-to-server interaction where some piece of logic is triggered by a data state and it's actually impacting another data state. And so all the inter-process communications that happen across our applications are represented by that. And oh, by the way, as we look at bots and pieces of code being the new, sort of building blocks of our digital world, these become the more voluminous and important things that we have to get our arms around in terms of their access methods and the way that we're governing and controlling that access via our cybersecurity policies and posture. And so looking at these processes and how they traverse these different elements sets up the landscape for how we want to bring more identity-defined security controls to work for us in the enterprise. And so it led us to this architecture. And this architecture is instructive for us so that we can understand how to place and categorize identity-defined security controls on this landscape so we can fit it to our portfolios as well as our ongoing risk management priorities. So we start with the endpoints, users, and data. Notice that I'm including under the users domain, humans, bots, processes, and actual code. And so this is important because we've built a lot of security around defending against or protecting human interactions. And we know that humans are often our weakest link because they can be phished and they have other vulnerabilities that are just human nature. We will find different types of strengths and weaknesses in code and bots and other processes that we start to secure. But what will be very important is, as this evolves, we're going to find that the preponderance of our actual policy footprint is going to wind up being all about digital and automated entities or users rather than just humans. We'll still need to protect all the human scenarios, but we'll also have to protect this vast portfolio of automated digital users and entities. And so looking at then, of course, we've got these different devices and services, network in between. We can break it down by actual application logic, compute facility, and storage in each of those entities. We can look at the security technologies that are active in the portfolios of the enterprise. Notice we've got some other slots there because these represent the ones that we've actually touched already with some of our identity-defined security controls. So we'll continue to advance that portfolio of security endpoints, if you will, of these controls. And what we're doing, as we said earlier, we're taking the identity technologies that are listed here and will continue to evolve as a portfolio, and we're tying together across context, risk, policy, and workflow to then show how a given set of identity-defined security controls is spanning this architecture. So that's the architecture. It's intentionally meant to be a useful map, right, where there's a bit of complexity in this because we're really trying to codify against your very complex enterprise security and identity and digital portfolios so that we can help you be successful across that entire scope. Now, the way that we deliver our resources, we have a combination of best practices, security controls, and use cases. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these today, and we'll be doing so with this latest lens of zero trust that we've been talking quite a bit about. So first off, best practices. These are mostly identity management-oriented hygiene tips, so things to get in place to make sure that your identity and access management infrastructure and approach and program are in good shape and ready to be leveraged for a more identity-defined security posture. Second, the security controls. These are specific controls that are intentionally built to be units of work or of change that you can apply a new control. It's bite-sized. It's represented by the ability to have the participating vendors in that control assert that they have a certified integration that they support, so that you know that they have your back as you start to leverage that capability in your architecture. The whole point of a security control is to have these modular wins across the portfolio so you can start reducing risk with identity-defined security in bite-sized chunks. And then last but not least, use cases. These tend to be broader views, major projects that then can look at the security controls and identify which security controls are useful for a broad brush project or approach I might take. So Zero Trust is one of these large use cases that we're using as a lens to examine how you can make progress in a context with these identity-defined security controls. Another one we might look at will be like the NIST cybersecurity framework, or other major projects, be it digital transformation or the move to Office 365. So we'll continue to add other use cases in priority order as we start to field enterprise commentary on how these lenses and use cases are helping them to put the controls into context. So let's look at Zero Trust and really play around with this topic a bit. I think it's a very timely time to be talking about Zero Trust. But you might ask why we would do that. There's been a lot of hype surrounding Zero Trust, so we're gonna bust some of that hype in defending why we would take a Zero Trust approach to identity-defined security. We'll talk a bit about what it represents and how you can start to tackle it yourself and get started. First off, though, on the why, I want to have a little bit of fun. We just actually are in the process of writing a blog on the 5 myths of Zero Trust, and Julie's actually in the process of getting this published right now. But these 5 myths we thought would help us sort of debunk some of the hype and mythical thinking that has accumulated around Zero Trust. First off, has Zero Trust jumped the shark? Lots of hype, right? Is it ridiculous? Is it even worth talking about? We'll talk a bit about that. Another myth, Zero Trust is focused solely on networks. Is that true? Certainly was a lot about that in the early days. It was all about, I can't trust this network, so I'm going to apply Zero Trust approaches, given the fact that I can't just let people into a network once I think they're secure enough to be on that network. I got to go deeper than that. But is it solely focused on that? We'll talk a bit about that. Does Zero Trust mean starting with no access? That would be bad, right? Hopefully that's a myth, because if starting with no access is the way this goes, I might be holding up users' ability to do what they need to do their jobs. Does Zero Trust mean you don't trust your employees? Well, that could be bad too if it got out of hand, but I want to really double click on what that truly means and how we have to think about that in debunking that myth. And last but not least, we'll talk about, does Zero Trust create bad user experiences? This would also be quite bad, because if Zero Trust is just this very controlling effect, has this very controlling effect on user behaviors, well, then we're going to have a revolt, right? If security is too tight for business to happen, then we've got a different issue in our hands. So it'll be important for us to debunk these myths. Let's start with the first one. Zero Trust has jumped the shark. And before I start, hopefully you know what this reference is to. It goes way back to an episode of Happy Days back in 1977, where Fonzie, our cool guy riding a motorcycle, wearing a leather jacket, actually shows off his water skiing prowess and decides to really exhibit some great bravery in jumping over a shark net in which a great white shark is swimming, and there's all kinds of build-up and music and all. And when this happened, it was this phrase occurred, jumping the shark, and it was representative of, now this show has lost any and all credibility it ever had, having any semblance of realism. Now, this was a sitcom, so it wasn't built to maintain its credibility per se, but jumping the shark became this phrase that basically indicates when something has gotten so overhyped or so overreached that it can't be trusted. So I would say we can't look to zero trust as a silver bullet, right? It can't be the thing that solves all of our problems. And zero trust would have jumped the shark if it was being viewed as a silver bullet. Instead, we need to think of it as a golden philosophy. We have to think of it as an approach, a posture, a philosophy that allows us to make better decisions about security policy and actually hold ourselves accountable to situations that are more trustworthy. That's what zero trust is all about. And if you just look at the terms, you might over-apply them to the context and get into trouble. So what about zero trust being focused solely on networks? I did a quick search on Google, and I looked, first of all, I looked for zero trust, and I got 419 million hits. Not bad, quite a few. And then when I looked at zero trust network, I only got 198 million. Okay, pretty reasonable subset, just about half. But then when I looked at zero trust system and zero trust application, I actually got more hits than zero trust network. And I think this helps identify the fact that zero trust is not just about networks. It's about systems and applications and really the whole portfolio that we're trying to protect. Now, I also then looked at some identity-related terms with zero trust, and I got a lower hit rate. And this is representative, I think, of the state of identity-defined security today. This is why we felt it was very important to form this alliance and help enterprises make more progress, because identity is not yet a household term either in security or in the zero trust dialogue, and we'd like to help change that. What about starting with no access? This, to me, is one of the trickier areas that we have to put some extra attention on. And I'd say, if we zoom out and think about the terms least privilege are, might be the two most important words in security right now. What does least privilege really mean? Least privilege is all about making sure that the user only has the access that they need to do their jobs. You could think of least privilege in the absolute term, which is, okay, all my digital workers get email, they get an AD identity, they get a basic login to, let's say, Office 365 or your Office suite, whatever you're using, and that's it, right? I start with that. Maybe I have to give them, I got to give them a login to the HR system so they can do their HR things and be part of that whole mechanism. But least privilege is really about across your entire population, only giving each user the least amount of privilege that they need. Now, we don't want zero trust to mean that users start with no access, because we actually want to get them their access as quickly as possible. So identity management is really all about automating identity-specific access on day one, right? Give that person the tools they need to do their job on day one so that they can be empowered immediately, but do so with some very intentional and policy-driven structure, right? Based upon their role, let's give them the tools that they need to do their job. If zero trust was imposed without any automation of provisioning users with the access they need to do their jobs, well, then it might very well be starting with no access. If we're waiting around for a manual process, then they are going to start with no access. But we can use identity technologies to automate with intentional policy what users get to do their jobs well. And when you add identity-defined security to this, we're now not just automating. We're automating with the precision of knowing not only the users, which we need to know from our identity management practices, but we're also wary of security context that's prevalent. We're quite wary of our existing security policies, how we've compartmentalized our resources, our networks, our access scenarios, our policies that are looking at device state, they're looking at geolocation, they're looking at intra-session behaviors. And so we can really start to add, via this union of identity and security, we can really start to add a much more precise and capable approach to not only not starting with no access, but automating access, automating appropriate access with great security controls. And then the last point there, monitoring and responding when we see that least privilege is inappropriately exceeded, right? So let's say we haven't done a good job of pruning back what a user needs when they shift one role to another. Well, we might see that there's a lack of usage on some of those access permissions, and we should discover that and actually remove them if we haven't already removed them based upon the role change that the user has had. All right, shifting gears. What about not trusting your employees? Well, I think this is really a matter of philosophy, because the question is, do you trust your employees? I'd say you can't trust your employees to be truly vigilant about all security choices, right? You can't trust them to choose security over convenience. Security awareness training has really helped us to trust employees to do a better job with some of these choices and to be more knowledgeable about the role they need to play in protecting the enterprise. But at the end of the day, we can't trust our employees to be truly effective as that weakest link in the security chain. And so I think the question here gets more to, do you have a PR problem? If you have a PR problem and you haven't adequately enrolled the user into their role in security, well then, a zero trust posture might start to manifest and trigger some of this negative pushback from users that don't see the fact that these policies are actually really good for the organization and they have a role to play. So here's a myth. Maybe I'm only partially debunking it, but I think it's important that the way one has to approach employees being aware of the fact that they don't even trust themselves, and that's okay. That's part of the problem that we're solving. Last but not least, does zero trust create bad user experiences? Well, it turns out I need look no further than one of our great end user stories in Adobe. They had a project that they called Zero Trust Enterprise Network, and these were the objectives that they had for the beginning of this project. They wanted to transform their network to be more cloud-like and to take on a more cloud-like state. They wanted to enable access without the need to be internal or use VPN. And they wanted that to be very secure based upon user and device posture and state, right? And so they embarked on this journey. You can see by eliminating the VPN in particular, they were looking to make the user experience even better because users didn't like logging into the VPN. And they felt like for several access scenarios, they could eliminate the need to log into the VPN because the VPN itself, because it used a basic password and was providing pretty big network access without a lot of other controls around it, it wasn't that secure anyway, right? And so they identified some obstacles. They worked through most of those obstacles. Where they couldn't get through obstacles, they adjusted the scope of the project. But they had a massive breakthrough in helping thousands of users. I think it was more than 10,000, which was a very substantial portion of their population, for major access scenarios, avoiding use of the VPN. This became not only a great win with the end users themselves, but amongst management and the credibility of this project, and it's led to a lot of other follow-on projects that are addressing additional opportunities to reduce risk, improve security, make compliance easier, and actually deliver a greater user experience. So I'd encourage you to look at that particular user story and think about how it might apply in your context. All right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our work product codified in the forms that we showed at the very beginning, the best practices as well as the security controls. And so first off, these best practices for identity-defined zero trust preparation, these are these identity management hygiene tips that we think are really, really important. And they're presented in a form of basic statements. Each of these could involve a variety of steps, but you would get the gist from these steps, which I would just want to take you through. First of all, making sure you formalize authoritative sources for your population. HR systems for employees, typically contractor management systems for employees, increasingly robotic process automation solutions for bots. Also, you're looking at your whole IaaS chain, how you're creating new containers. That's another origination point for something that will start to take the form of an identity with access scenarios that you need to protect. So getting those authoritative sources understood and fitting into your mechanisms will be really key. Directory structures and group structures, really important building block to have settled. A lot of companies wind up with a lot of group bloat because they start using groups for a variety of things, and before they know it, they don't really have an easily or well-managed hierarchy of groups they can rely upon that is pruned for purpose in the current state. So that bloat tends to allow for a lot of stuff that's misunderstood and not yet active, and so it's a big project to fix all of it, but starting perhaps with the more sensitive areas and working through that so that you have a better group structure is a really good building block for identity management and identity-defined security. Sensitive data. Zero Trust, took form when John Kindervag really introduced the concept over 10 years ago while he was at Forrester, to looking at sensitive data and not trusting a lot of scenarios whereby sensitive data was being accessed. So whether it's DLP or other forms of data security and protection that you've already embarked on, leveraging what you've done already to understand where your sensitive data is an important building block to rely upon as you now apply a identity-defined security posture to sensitive data. Of course, privileged accounts is another really important area where whether you have a privileged access management system, be it from CyberArk, Beyond Trust, Dichotic, or what have you, or not, knowing where those privileged accounts exist, really important, because you have to start to nail them down. They are indeed the #1 target of your attackers because they hold the most leverage, and they hold leverage that can be gained in a legitimate way, right? Think about it. That's what the attackers want to get to, because they can go log into a system and have their way with that system as a privileged user, with all of that being appropriate because they've actually compromised an existing identity that has those permissions. Establishing sources for identity context and risk. So your identity governance systems, your identity providers, your access management and single sign-on systems have a lot of identity context. Your risk management systems and or your SIM and SOAR systems are great sources for context that you then will increasingly pool and leverage in these solutions as you go forward. And then security operations, right? Thinking about how you can help your SOC, which has traditionally used not very identity-specific technologies, not very identity-oriented technologies. Help that SOC team start to be more aware of identity context through some of these flows of information and what you can supply those analysts in terms of their follow-through on responding to events and incidents will be a big part of the process. And as you add security, identity-defined security controls, they will involve some of the tool set that SOC team is already using, like SIM and SOAR, but then we'll also give them some options for automating response in a very identity-specific way. And so making them aware of how that works and having them on board will be a key starting point for this move in this direction. Let's talk about some core methods for identity-defined zero trust. One, and these are a bit long, but I want to step through them relatively quickly. Ensure all of your data applications and infrastructure are accessed securely with authentication and access control matched to the identities, privilege, and context involved. That's a biggie, right? I wanted to read through it so we could now break it down into constituent parts, right? So what we're accessing is data applications and infrastructure. So those are the targets. We know that we're always winding up manipulating or reading a piece of data in those processes, as we mentioned before. But we want all those access scenarios to be secure, and that security is either going to be very basic if the access scenario or the target is not particularly sensitive, or it's going to be very, very well controlled and have great oversight if it's very sensitive. So that is the privilege and context that's coming to play there. So it's super sensitive data, or a super sensitive process, or even involving just a user that has lots of access, whereby their access scenario actually might be exploited to understand their identity and hack that identity and get to the other things that they can do. These are all triggers for a higher level of control. We want to govern identities and permissions with a least privilege access strategy. So we alluded to this earlier, but if you think about how least privilege is applied as a principle across all of the access scenarios, we want to engage in what I like to refer to as continuous pruning of access, particularly privileged access. That continuous pruning is typically triggered by a change in the role of the user or the entity, and when that role changes, we want to remove the privileges that were associated with the prior role and add the privileges that are associated with the new role. If we don't, we get privileged entitlement creep, and that entitlement creep, as it accumulates, represents additional attack surface area. And what I like to connect this to is, you know how the lateral movement aspect of the attack chain is a trial and error process. The trial and error process is moving from one system that's been compromised by a simpler method like phishing and now moved into different methods trying to move laterally to get to a system or an identity or an account that has more privileges. Well, that lateral movement is basically a bit of a grope in the dark, but if it happens upon a piece of privileged access that is available to it, it's going to exploit it. Therefore, we want to remove all instances of privileged access that are unnecessary, because unless we do, we're making it easier for that trial and error process to be more successful. The attacker can hit pay dirt more easily with that additional access that's out there that hasn't been continuously pruned back. That's a whole topic unto itself, but I wanted to summarize it for you today. Of course, we want to log and analyze all user and process behaviors. We've been doing this at the infrastructure level for quite a long time, but we haven't been doing this as well at the very user-specific and process-specific level. When you look at what's happening in AWS as a microcosm of all this, CloudTrail is actually logging in AWS all the API calls. And this is the new era, right? This is, being able to have all that data and analyze all that data really gets you into some high fidelity and great scope of being able to analyze all that's going on. This was never true in the past, but it needs to be increasingly true of the way that we're logging and analyzing user and process behaviors, because the things that are being exploited are within that haystack. And so you're all on some portion of the journey to do a better job of logging and analyzing everything, but this will be up-leveling that to include very user-specific things will be part of your maturity evolution. Applying an identity-specific approach to incident prioritization, analysis, response, remediation. This is equipping the SOC with more of those identity-specific views. One of the things that we see happening in the enterprise adoption and practice in this world is having their first-level analysts maybe not seeing the user's identity, because it might involve some pretty good insight into their actual behaviors, which is maybe somewhat private. So controlling who has access to that is a good thing. And so maybe having the first-level alerts and the first-level review by the first-level analysts being seen with anonymity, but you see the logic of the alert that might involve something that's identity-specific and even behavior-specific and maybe sensitive. But then when you actually you have an alert and you're going to investigate that further and really get down to the bottom of what's going on and try to formulate a response, maybe having that view be more identity-specific and more private, but bumping that up to a smaller community of analysts that can be controlled and monitored themselves with the right levels of controls for how they handle that private information is a good practice and starting to emerge in this domain. Okay. Now, I talked about best practices, talked about core methods. Now let's talk about identity-defined security controls, and we'll highlight a couple that are pertinent to Zero Trust before we close it out and take some questions. So this list of identity-defined security controls is if you look at that middle bucket of work product that we're rolling out, we had the best practices on the left, we had the identity-defined security controls in the middle, and we had the use cases, which like Zero Trust, on the right. This set of identity-defined security controls, to me, is the real business end of this effort, meaning each one of these controls represents a building block for identity-defined security where you can rely upon an opportunity to leverage two technologies working well together to then achieve an outcome that's going to raise the precision of your security and help you to reduce risk and therefore be in a better position for compliance. And so there's a variety of items listed here. This is not yet comprehensive. We've built this set of controls so far as a starting point based upon, as vendors, what we've already experienced in terms of requests to integrate our technologies with that of other vendors. And so amongst our membership, we've had existing integrations, which was what helped drive this effort, some of this effort in the first place. What we're now doing is we're looking at this set of controls and we're refining the way that we document them and enable you to have success with them. And we're also then sketching, where does this list need to go? What will be a more holistic, comprehensive scope where we can point to a taxonomy of controls that we feel is representative of a complete set. So that is an ongoing effort, and we welcome all input for that, of course, as we continue to work through this journey. Let me talk now about a couple of examples of identity-defined security controls that are particularly pertinent to Zero Trust. I've highlighted 4 here. In the interest of time, I'm going to spend some time on 2. So the first one is IGA plus PAM, Lifecycle Provisioning and Deprovisioning of Privileged Access. A really important control, happens to be something that I've seen a lot given my role at SailPoint working with the Privileged Access Management vendors. But this takes Privileged Access Management and Identity Governance and integrates it to perform this very, very critical control of lifecycle provisioning and deprovisioning of privileged access. The key thing that happens here is you can now have a change in identity status that happens throughout the life cycle of that identity, trigger a reapplication of privileged access management permissions to that particular user. So I remove privileges that aren't yet required by that, are no longer required by that user given their prior role, and I add the ones that are needed for their new role. The other thing, of course, is you accelerate empowering that user with their privileged access based upon an HR event that can then be automated by the identity governance system to provision these privileges, right? Really, really important to get people productive immediately. And of course, you terminate when the user leaves the organization, and this is still something that large organizations are struggling to do systematically. You take the most privileged access capabilities and you remove them upon termination. Super, super important. Companies are still not doing this across the board, and so it's a really important thing to tackle. And so the value to the organization, of course, is we're empowering the user faster, and we're really eradicating a very large amount of risk for inappropriate or unnecessary access being still present, particularly following a termination event. How it pertains to Zero Trust? Well, pretty clearly, right? This is we can't trust, we can't trust terminated employees to be really careful with their access. They might, they might be more compromisable to exploit that access, or to have it remaining on a system that, let's say, when they move to a new company that has poorer security practices, is more easily compromised, it can be found and now sold, even though it's pertinent to a different company, your company, that can now be attacked via the use of that privileged access mechanism. So we can't trust employees to be really vigilant with that, so we must be proactive about removing that access. I want to talk about one other one. This is login denied for compromised device. And so what it does is it integrates access management, these are the single sign-on MFA guys, with unified endpoint management. These are the folks that are looking at all of the device state, both in terms of security, mobility controls, state of patching of the operating system, et cetera. And it allows an access management system which tends to have a reasonable amount of context, but can get a lot more context, particularly on device state, when they talk to a unified endpoint management system. And if that UEM indicates that that device has indications of compromise, IOCs, or other policy failing attributes, well, then we can deny the login. And this is obviously has great value. It can really stop that lateral movement scenario where compromised devices are being used by attackers to then log in to services from those particular devices that they've actually reached via the compromise. And so one of the tie-in back to Zero Trust, of course, is that we really can't trust that our device security will be perfect. And so therefore, the UEM system is able to signal where it's imperfect. And we've got a state that actually should trigger a situation where we should impose a better, a more stringent control on the situation. So with that, I want to bring us to a close. I want to point out several Zero Trust resources on our website. There's a white paper on how Zero Trust starts with identity. There's also some customer stories there, including the one that I mentioned that Adobe has shared with us. There's actually Logarithm's Journey to Zero Trust is available as a customer story and is going to be shared in the form of a webinar coming up on September 26th. So feel free to join us for that. And in closing, I'll just ask all of you, hopefully you are interested in joining our community and commenting on our work product and this journey that we're on, because that's what's going to help us to continue to tune it to the needs of the enterprise and the way that that enterprise is wrestling with not only the threat landscape that ever advances, but their ability to leverage identity-defined security practices to be more effective, reducing risk and improving business outcomes for their company. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie in case there are any questions coming from the audience.
Yeah, Joe, thank you. That was great content. A reminder, if you have a question, we've got a couple of minutes left for Joe to answer questions. Reminder to enter it into the Q&A chat window. We do have a couple questions hopefully we can get to. One, Zero Trust still seems a little overwhelming. How do I get started?
Well, it can be overwhelming, and we probably contributed to that a little bit today because we covered a lot of ground. But that's the whole goal of taking some of these security controls and making them very targeted for bite-size, risk reduction, given a set of technologies that you've probably already deployed and actually can get more value out of them if you turn on this control by making sure that they're leveraging an integrated capability that exists. And that's why we're sort of hunting for those that we can make people aware of. We can point to some relatively standardized sort of uses of these controls. And relative to your risk priority management, you can get started by identifying areas where you know you've got some risk and you want to take some bite-sized steps with your highest risks with these controls that we're helping you to adopt. I think that's a great way to get started. And then over time, you'll get more familiar with where you want to go next and how you can avoid being overwhelmed by doing everything at once. This is not a portfolio all-at-once game. This is a portfolio incrementing over time.
Great, thanks, Joe. Another question coming in, is there documentation on all the IDSA controls? You presented 2 of them today, but what about the rest?
Yes, so we have an existing set of controls on the website. We're actually in the process of refining what it is we share for each. So you'll see some materials there already today, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going to now take that to the next level where we're sharing even more information that is more codified, similar to some of the things that I've shown you today in terms of the benefits of the organization, its pertinence to some of our use cases like Zero Trust, and also not just vendors that are participating in the endpoint of the control, but we're going to start to publish combinations of vendors that have certified the integration that delivers the control. So much more explicit identification of those combinations of vendors that you can rely upon, particularly if you have those vendors active in your portfolio, to be able to help you deliver that control.
Okay, great. Here we've got another question coming in. I'm going to read this one verbatim. At a time when the incidence of synthetic identity and fraudulent identity is growing significantly, I was surprised to hear so little on identity integrity before onboarding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, or observation. So we have, maybe I took it on too much faith, right? That you would be not only authenticating people for who they say they are, but there's a lot of talk about identity proofing and really making sure that we're having some good vigilance over, the actual origination of identities. Now that's where the authoritative sources are really, really important. And so, enterprises wrestle with that a little bit because they often do not have perfect authoritative sources for all identities, and oftentimes they have multiple systems they have to rely upon. So that is that can be a garbage in, garbage out problem if you don't do it well. And where you aren't doing it well, you should know that, and you should have better controls to compensate for where your authoritative sources are either suspect, incomplete, etc. Identity proofing is another thing that we're starting to, enterprises are starting to look at more and more. It starts to get into some of those privacy matters of knowing who a person is in their private life versus also in their enterprise life. There are obviously some live rails there to be concerned about. But within those boundaries, I see enterprises, really having to get to the source of the origination of the identity and make sure they have very secure practices for extending those first credentials and then operating from there. So yes, fair point, and that's a good reminder to me to perhaps make that more clear and evident as we go forward.
Yeah, the only other thing I guess I would add is we do have a new member in the IDSA that just joined recently, so we'll definitely be incorporating that element into the security controls as we go forward. So lastly, let's see if we can get this last one in. Not specific to Zero Trust, but more to longer-term strategy of IDSA. Is the IDSA looking to establish any IDSA-focused certifications for individuals and organizations?
Interesting question. Yeah, so we aren't today focused on certifying individuals, but we are talking to various outfits that are more focused on that. So just to be clear, our focus right now is on developing a more adoptable set of frameworks and controls and practices for identity-defined security. We see that as something that is unique and novel and required in the industry today. We're not focused on either training or certifying practice. But Julie, maybe you'd like to mention, the organization that we've been talking to that is involved in that, and how we might share some of our content with that organization and get some leverage on some joint goals.
Yeah, I think that is a great question. So we are members of ID Pro. For those that may or may not be familiar, ID Pro is a identity and access management professional organization. They are working towards essentially creating more and more identity and access management professionals. So we've been talking to them about aligning our content with their body of knowledge and certification program. I think that, our mission is around making security professionals more identity aware. So over time, we'll continue to evolve towards that strategy and see what makes sense. So it's definitely something that we are looking at ways to do that, whether it's through other organizations or in the future through IDSA itself. So I think we're a little bit past time. Joe, I just want to thank you for the great content you presented and your time today, as well as your ongoing contribution to the IDSA. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. As mentioned, you'll receive a link to the webinar recording that you can share with your colleagues who might have missed. And we hope that you'll join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks again for attending.